We're going to give folks a couple minutes to arrive in our Zoom room for our HOTAC meeting 10. It's been a minute. We've been meeting together.
We've been hanging out with you all for a long time. It's um it's a Tuesday that feels like a Monday though, so we'll see. We'll see who makes it.
And simultaneously like a really long Thursday.
You know, I love a short week, but it definitely has some ripple effects. If nobody else shows up, Sam and Tom, you're gonna have to do a lot of work today to fix all of our issues.
Uh, I mean, I think Michael and Daisy were just talking about it, so I would assume that they'll be here any minute.
Okay, that's good news.
Hello. All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started, and as others on our team arrive, we'll just incorporate them into the flow of today. Thank you, everybody, for coming this afternoon after our Labor Day break, getting back in the saddle after a long weekend. Um, we have a pretty informal agenda today. We want to walk through some of the key changes in the version 2 of the DLCD rules. I think you all have had at least a little time to take a look, and if not, Thea will do a brief overview of those things, and we just really want to make sure that we answer any questions, and if there's additional changes or feedback that you all have before it goes to the printer, we want to hear that too. So we don't have a highly structured set of questions, but really are interested in robust feedback from you all. So y'all get plenty of time to talk today. Um, and so to get us started, I think Thea's going to just contextualize where we're at in the process and where we're going from here.
That's right. If I can just find my Zoom button and some other buttons like how to share my screen. Gosh. I'm going to do this, and then there is a way to do this so that you can see my slides and it doesn't take over everything. Hold on just a minute. View, maybe this view, that works. Okay. So yeah, I just wanted to sort of take a sec to bring us back to where we are in the process and talk through sort of what the next steps are. What we are looking at for the next few weeks really are several like formal steps that DLCD needs to go through to get to the point where we file these rules with the Secretary of State. But I particularly want to sort of draw your attention to a couple of items on this calendar. The Secretary of State notice, which is October 1st. Sorry, hold on just a minute. Let me clear this screen so I can see what I'm talking about. October 1st marks sort of a shift in the way that we receive input and feedback, but it doesn't mean that that's the last chance to adjust the rules. So it's sort of more like a 5-minute warning or something like that. After this is the rules are submitted to the Secretary of State, there is an opportunity to submit your feedback but it actually goes through LCDC. So that's, so it will still come to us, but it goes through the commission. And we'll give you information about how to do that. But it does sort of shift that process. We are not going to cease our HOTAC meetings. We have 2 more on the books. And the first one, October 8th, is actually a test run. Actually, the next 2 are test runs. And I'll just say, we've been doing a certain type of technical work in this committee up until this point. We're really going to kind of pivot now to a different, like using our technical brains to do a kind of a different set of exercises. And that is to actually run through parts of this acceleration program to do like, to run through hypothetical examples to see how it works. And we really are excited about this. Actually, this is kind of like where it gets fun. And I think that it's also where, another place where you all will be super, super useful. So the first one is on the 8th, on October 8th, and we're going to run through an audit barrier. And really that's working through the sample. We haven't come up with the perfect example barrier yet, but we'll get that out to you soon. One that sort of encompasses a lot of the different elements that we're trying to incorporate. Really what it looks like to flag the barrier, to identify the key parties and their responsibilities, and then to propose some strategies to address those barriers. So just walking through all the steps that DLCD will have to go through in real life. On October 22nd, we will come back to do a similar exercise, but with the referral process. And in that one, we're going to be using anonymized data to work through sort of top to bottom, the full referral process. And our colleagues at OHCS and our consultants with EGO are working on collecting this data so that we have something real to work with to do that. So just looking ahead, that's where we're going to sort of need your brains. Then, the rest of this calendar year, we're just pushing to the LCDC rule adoption, which ultimately happens on the 5th of December. I also want to note, and we've mentioned this a couple of times, but in November, we're going to sort of shift again to this adoption ready action and model code work group. And again, this is an opportunity for anybody who's interested to continue in this work. You're not required to, your commitment is considered honored. But if you are interested in seeing sort of the next step of this as we develop, we're going to merge with folks in the NAPTAC and some of the folks in the CAUTAC, and kind of have a sort of different type of work going forward. We'll get you more information about that, but I do want you to have that on the radar. And yeah, with that, I guess any questions about the next steps? All right, just reach out, let me know if you have any thoughts or questions about that. I do want to sort of recenter us in our racial equity framework, and talk to you a little bit about, these central questions that help us to sort of frame out the accountability work where we started from. And as we sort of close in on the final language of the rule, to be sure that we're still aligning with the key intentions. And I will just read through the questions that frame out this particular area of the racial equity framework. So these are: how does the rule address accountability measures for both DLCD and local governments? What are the accountability measures for the local government in this rule? How will DLCD track compliance? And what are the incentives and disincentives for not meeting compliance? Do the accountability measures include engaging with communities? And if yes, how is this done? If no, why not? And I'll just add sort of, is there anything that can be done to strengthen that element of this? And finally, what are the challenges and opportunities for accountability for DLCD and the local government in this area? And what are some ideas to address this? So just having that in the back of our minds while we're going through this, I think it will really get us closer and keep us centered on the goals of this this rulemaking. I'm going to move to the next slide. And Cadence, I think that we're going to take a couple minutes to just throw back a little bit to the joint NAP and HATAC meeting and talk through some of the top takeaways there.
Yeah, so we've listed a couple here about the takeaways, but really we're very much interested in your thoughts on how that joint meeting went. Any kind of lasting things that you think are appropriate for our work in the HATAC, or any ongoing desires that you have regarding, joint meetings or the work that's happening to synthesize the work that's being done in the NAPTAC and the HATAC to have one seamless process. So your thoughts and about the meeting that we had with NAPTAC. Do you remember the meeting we had with NAPTAC?
Honestly, I had to go back and get reminded.
Michael.
I remember not thinking that it was a major emergency that you were taking we were all asking for you to take a rapid departure and direction. And I did think it was a major emergency. You're taking a rapid departure and direction when I read these rules. So that's a different.
Okay.
That's a good teaser, Michael. I can't.
It was, I know. I was like, let's move past this. No, but I do want to pause a moment on this concept of establishing our commitment to affirmatively furthering fair housing in the housing production strategy, and then the acceleration program being attentive to following through on how that's working out in the acceleration process. And one of the things that we were trying to address in that joint meeting and also through all of our work is making sure that the acceleration program itself is furthering equitable outcomes. And so are we hitting the mark? If we are not hitting the mark, how can we do better in this process? And we kept kind of coming back to, well, the housing production strategy itself is where the fair housing issue areas are addressed and other equitable outcome issues and actions are identified. And so, but what in the referral, the audit, the acceleration agreement needs to help reinforce those pieces. And so we'll kind of come back to that, I think, in our discussion today. So let's just kind of pin that for the moment. But it is something that I'm hoping we're all keeping in mind. I know DLCD is continuing to think about that and wanting to make sure that we have practical and usable measures in the acceleration program to help ensure equitable outcomes. Okay. Thea, why don't we move on to the next step?
Okay, sounds good, and we will. I think both of these points are addressed later in the conversation, and definitely want to open that up a little bit more down the line. So we will return to these thoughts. This is essentially what the major changes are in the substantive changes are in the version 2 of the rules. And I'm going to sort of show you this real quickly, but then we're going to dive into some of the details a little bit further down. Essentially, enabling a little bit of more flexibility for cities to change the actions in order to address an identified need, to address what some people were concerned about, having a chilling effect on on cities being able to be really ambitious in their HPS work. So we've tried to tie this together with NAPTAC, NAPTAC rules to encourage some sort of options for Plan Bs, and again, talk about that a little bit more down the line. It removes sort of the best practice policy. I'm trying to not use the language safe harbor because that's confusing to everybody, but as a mitigating factor to look at what kind of if there's a set of best practices that a city could adopt that could sort of allow it to just move ahead and not be part of the group of cities that are referred. And we'll talk about why we heard sort of some strong opinions about removing that, and why we decided to take that out for this version of the rules. Also reinforces the connection between audit process considerations and affirmatively furthering fair housing in the HPS. Just that was more of a language connection, but it's a really important one, and it's another area where we, I'm actually really curious if there are other opportunities to sort of dig in there and strengthen that a little bit more even. It sort of clarifies the consideration of resources in several places, and I'll sort of show you, I'll pull out the areas of rule where we did increase the clarity there, hopefully. And that's in response to, still a fair amount of concern from cities that capacity and resources are not being considered thoroughly enough as we approach this. And finally, tying the audit really closely to the HPS, and that's especially in two ways. One is to ensure that in the audit, the DLCD refers to engagement that the city has already done in their housing work. And this was in response to a concern of sort of overburdening communities with engagement obligations. So to make sure that we're really making the best use of engagement that's already happened, and then also to really highlight actions that the city has already adopted in their HPS that can be applied to specific barriers. So to make sure that we're not sort of requiring the city to essentially duplicate work that they've already done, but to refer back to the HPS. And so I'll jump into this and talk a little bit more about each one of these, and then we'll open it up to a conversation sort of about everything. And just checking, I think that's the best way to do it, although we could also sort of take these one by one. What do you think?
I think maybe let's take them one by one to just break up the meeting.
Sounds good. I'd rather not talk. Okay. So yeah, here we're getting into action flexibility. You'll find this in OX15 sub 1AB. So
is there a page reference for that in the matrix?
Tom,
I don't even know where to look for X.
Is that right?
Does anybody have it right in front of them? I don't have the matrix up on my.
I think it starts on page 53, and May.
This is one of the earlier sections in the acceleration program, so it should be in the 50.
There we go. Okay. Got it.
Awesome. So essentially, this enables flexibility in the referral process. I'm just going to read what I have here on the slide, for cities to change actions to address an identified need. So that means that they can shift. If a proposed action seems that it's not going to be effective or be feasible, the city is given a sort of a wide latitude to shift to do another action that addresses the same need. And so the language here is intended to ensure that, you know, although we're statutorily required to refer any city that doesn't take action on a particular action in their HPS, there are opportunities for a city to address it if it's not so that a city really doesn't end up in this like very tight spot. And so hopefully this addresses that concern about providing some increased flexibility. And this is just one section of this. Really, this has to be paired with the updates that are in the HPS rule, which are also encouraging exploratory work as an element of the action selection, and really really allowing sort of multiple paths to compliance and to success. But yeah, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about this language change, and if this sufficiently, you know, lifts the concern that this provision, I don't know, kind of puts a lid on how ambitious cities are willing to be in their HPSs and in their plans for addressing particular needs.
Folks,
Go ahead. If I'm not explaining something well, let me know. My brain is kind of slow today, to be honest.
go ahead,
Sam, go
Sam.
ahead.
Yeah, I am overall, I would say in favor of this change. I think that through the accountability process, there's still a chance to address those things if it ends up that the replacement strategy was not sufficient. And I also think that it will probably give cities a little more confidence, especially I could see where with like maybe budget intensive strategies or things that you know, they're afraid to do because of unknowns like a global pandemic or something that could really impact a city's budget. And so if that comes up, then you know they'll have a plan B to address those same needs. So I think personally, I think it's a step in the right direction.
Great. Thank you. Michael.
I guess maybe my questions to Samuel, what is the remedy later in the accountability process you mentioned?
Well, you know, down the road, if it doesn't produce the units that it's going to, then the city could be referred for performance-based reasons.
And why do they care if they're referred? Like first of all, it requires like you to continue to miss your targets, which everybody's going to miss their targets. Like we know that, right? So the question is really, are you overperforming or underperforming? So maybe you're underperforming as a result of this. But then like, is it just being scared of a LCDC order? Is that the only reason that you're going to be like wanting to get this right? Like, I don't understand if we don't hold cities to what they say they're going to do, why they can't always back down from whatever is politically difficult.
I think, Michael, the idea is that we're trying to encourage cities to pick a suite of options that address a single issue. And if they find that they can't do one, that they need to do another, and that they have to be like for like. So maybe we can't do a construction excise tax, but we can identify general fund that we can use. Maybe we can't do one intervention, but we can do another, and to give a little bit of flexibility for them to offer up maybe the more assertive one But if there are one or two alternatives that can get them to generally the same place, that they can identify those as well. That's the concept. Now, whether that just dilutes the HPS to a degree that you think is inappropriate, maybe that's part of the question and conversation.
I mean, it certainly empowers the HPS process a lot less. Maybe that's fine. I mean, you make a good case, I think, for that being okay. I'd love to get Tom's take as somebody who's just been straight through that same ringer, or Barbara's. I don't know where you are in your cycle. But I guess I worry that there will never be a good time to do something that's politically difficult. And if you aren't required to commit to anything, then you won't.
I'll just say real quick, I do want to hear from the folks at the cities also, and I appreciate that, Michael. I think that, you know, just historically, the way the HPS program has been set up and was designed is not to hold cities to a particular action. And that's why cities are allowed to choose their own suite of actions. It's to address an identified need. So the way that we thought about it as we worked through this problem that we're hearing, you know, very much from both the city angle and the advocacy angle, was as long as an action addresses the need, it's not necessarily the place of DLCD to say which action that needs to be, and that really ensuring this flexibility. I mean, I definitely hear you in terms of providing a backstop, a political backstop, and I think that is key to the program. But allowing multiple paths is also something that we heard loud and clear, that there needs to be some kind of option for cities so they're not backed into a corner. Just sort of giving you the sort of the like what it looked like as we worked through that particular problem, and would love to again hear what folks think if this successfully achieves it without diluting it too much. And if it does dilute it too much, let's talk about what else needs to happen in the HPS program and in the framing of the HPS program to make sure that it's strong enough.
Samuel.
Well, I also want to hear from the cities, but I'll just say if there was some kind of limit on the number of alterations that could happen in a planning cycle, I would be in favor of that.
Great, thank you. Tom or Barbara, do you have thoughts on this one?
I'll say I'm of two minds of this. Like, you know, from a practical reality, there's resource constraints and, you know, stuff doesn't work or is infeasible and you move on to the next one. And it's nice to have that flexibility and being able to show that you're working on the issue, so to speak. I worry about others that just don't want to do it, right? And some of the regional conversations going on around some of our suburban jurisdictions, they're not going to do it. They're not going to fund the projects. They're not going to, it's not our responsibility, whatever. They're not going to do it. And so, you know, we don't build apartments in our city. It's not what our community wants. Then what are you guys going to do with that? And this to me says, oh, we're going to go explore this one. And at the end of the 6 years, we're going to go put it in to the next HPS and kick it out 3 more years. And, you know, and as long as we're producing some housing and we're not in the bottom 50%, we don't have to do it. And so how are you going to hook those people in that are actively opposing or not taking action kind of thing, because it's not politically tenable in their you know, oh, I don't have resources. Well, you do have the resources, you just haven't prioritized them to this. And so I sort of worry more about the bad actor that is, you know, intentionally avoiding or not trying to take on these actions. And I don't know, I can see where this gives them too much leeway.
Yeah. So perhaps something like limiting like a like for like action. So you couldn't substitute an exploratory action for something that was a solid, we're going to address this by kind of action. So making sure that the supplemental or alternative action is equal to or better than what was originally proposed, just to kind of close up some of those opportunities for the reluctant jurisdictions to slide by.
And I will say that this section of rule does not describe, you know, what that shift looks like very clearly. But I do want to encourage everybody to go back and look at the section that's in the HPS element of the rule. And I don't have the citation in front of me, but I will send that to you all to read through, because that does actually have a pretty a relatively prescriptive like set of steps that you need to go through in order to shift from an action that has an exploratory element to an action that has a set of commitments also included in that. So I will say that this alone, I don't think addresses this issue fully, but really paired with that, what was developed out in the HPS section, I think might respond to some of what what I'm hearing, some of the concerns that I'm hearing. But yeah, again, I would love to hear from Barbara, and curious if after everybody digs into that language, and maybe you have, if this is still where you're landing.
So I have an appreciative view of the option to provide an alternative if we're finding that one is not working. I appreciate that. I see Tom's point as well about the bad actors. And I would say that this provision is probably really important to little jurisdictions like mine, where we really are really cash strapped and we're doing the best we can. And we already have a lot of affordable housing. And much of it is naturally occurring affordable housing that I am hopeful will come out in the census information that is not accounted for elsewhere. But the important thing I think to remember is that those bad actors are going to be bad actors regardless of what we have in this text, and I won't say punish, but to affect all jurisdictions with the same brush, whether it's positive or negative, is difficult, especially for smaller jurisdictions to comply with. So I'm just speaking from a small jurisdiction. I appreciate it, the flexibility and the ability to find an alternative if one's not working.
Michael.
I don't think don't hear any of us saying that it's unreasonable to be able to find a like for like alternative. I think that it's so the scenario, I don't see, maybe you see something that I don't, Barbara, but like, how would Cornelius agree to something in its HPS that's like wildly out of scale for what it could do in the first place. Like you're saying that you're worried about the scenario where Cornelius can't afford to do something, so it can't do the thing that it said it was going to do in the HPS, so it needs to try a different approach. And I can imagine that being something that like emerges due to a changing situation in Cornelius, I guess. But in terms of like, oh, there's this wildly ambitious move that we put in our HPS, but now we're going to revise it to like some other wildly ambitious thing that's more feasible. I don't understand the scenario in which this is useful to Cornelius, I guess.
So our last HPS was done before the requirements in this legislation. We have implemented all of the strategies that we identified. And we have done more. We just proposed some height changes that City Council will hopefully act on in October. But none of them were required because we got in before these requirements. We don't have a big budget. We don't have cash to contribute to affordable housing. We do have a CET, but we use it for our general fund, to be honest with you, because we don't have a big tax base. And we have a high proportion of non-taxable property in the city. We have a large number of churches, group homes, nonprofits. They have found that our city, it has been traditionally lower cost for land acquisition. And so we have a high proportion of these non-taxable properties. So our revenue will never be, even if we had more land area, our revenue will never be the same as a city of equal size that had a different tax base to start out with. So many of the actions that would create a lot of affordable housing, we can't implement. We just can't do it.
Sure. And yeah, I'm not questioning that. I'm saying, what's the specific scenario where you're changing something for all those reasons? Like you said, you want this flexibility. I'm saying I'm worried about it not turning out to be like for like. And you're saying, I mean, it's what I hear you saying is, I don't want to get stuck committing to something bigger than we can actually do. So then it wouldn't be a like for like, it seems to me.
And I don't think I'm saying that I don't want like for like. I don't think I ever said that.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. Immediately.
So I think I'm agreeing with you on like for like. What I was just saying is that I appreciate the flexibility that this offers, this change offers, and that I think that for at least my city size and my city circumstances, this is really helpful. If we were ever to get into the circumstance where we are in the bottom and we need to look at changes.
Sure. I don't want to belabor it, so thank you so much. That helps.
All right, Thea, why don't we move to the next one? And I guess I'll also say we're going to walk through these specific examples and then we want to open it up for general comments, questions, and we can also circle back if we need to.
Yes, absolutely. And interesting, super interesting conversation. So thank you for diving into that. And we can come back to it also if we want to. I'll say, okay, so this next one essentially simplifies the referral. Like I said, it removes this what we were calling a mitigating factor. Sorry, hold on just a minute. Well, we have no school today yet. sorry. So it essentially strikes this this mitigating factor of using a set of best practices as a sort of a safe harbor. And there were a few reasons why this was taken out of consideration. And I will say, I personally really like this tool and I want to see it developed. But I think that the concern was we don't have enough information yet, and that it may not be a reliable tool that works right now in the acceleration program. There is certainly an interest in developing something like this to be part of potentially the Goal 10 planning system, or at least part of DLCD's approach to housing. But for right now, we simply did not have enough information, and that was the loudest and the loudest consensus that we heard, although there was a big spread and a lot of different opinions here. So I do want to throw this out on the table. One of the concerns that we heard, and I'll just sort of remind everybody, I think this came up in the joint meeting, was from Andre, Dr. Tremblay, who really said that there is no identified set of best practices, and that there's kind of a concern that there isn't sufficient information about what really works to spur housing production, affordability, and choice in the broad range of cities and jurisdictions that are in Oregon that are going to be subject to this new set of rules. Sort of relatedly, there's a skepticism about it, sort of one size fits all response to need, that when a city identifies a need through their contextualized housing need and their HPS, they are really digging deep into their community. And to sort of plop down a set of responses may not be sensitive, to what those specific needs are. Even if they sort of are demonstrably working in a lot of other places, they may not respond to the need that's identified in that community. And finally, there is a question about, if this is a program that's about outcomes, why would we sort of backtrack in the acceleration program and say, this is actually just about sort of best effort? So that's another kind of concern that we heard, that if we're just looking at outcomes, then why are we kind of going back to where the HPS started and looking at best practices? So those are some of the many different responses that we heard, so I'll sort of throw it back to you all, open this up for conversation. Taking this out was it was something that we went back and forth about, but seemed like maybe it would be useful going forward to continue this conversation.
All right, Michael.
This is the part that really concerned me. Not because I think that the way that the previous proposal is the only way to do things, but because I feel like the program is sort of rudderless without this at the moment. I would say the interesting thing about ONA is that it is both about outcomes and about actions. It's not, it's rooted in outcomes. That's the ultimate escape hatch, is you get your outcomes and then you don't have to do a damn thing the state says. But if you don't get those outcomes, then you are held accountable. And this was what Rep. Dexter introduced to the process and referred us to again and again. You're accountable to the things that are within your control. And there's not a long list, as Barbara and Tom and others have been saying, there's not a long list of things that are truly within every city's control, but there are a few. And we could make a list of those things, it seems to me. And we could say you have to allow manufactured housing parks on 20% of your land, and you have to allow four-story apartment buildings on 20% of your land. And then if you're in one city, one option is going to be viable, and another city, another option is going to be viable, but those are both fair housing actions, it seems to me. So the uh to the point about the I guess that was Mike trying to walk backwards through the points you were echoing there, Thea, but to be more productive, hopefully. I do hear what I've heard from Sam and others that like you don't want to let people off the hook of either your production targets or your equity targets because of something that is just sort of ceremonial, like, oh, you can, if you get some, if you can check this box, then you don't have to worry about anything ever again. I think in the case of the equity targets, I wonder if there might be a way to rearrange the flow chart somewhat so that checking this box gets you out of a basic audit, but not a comprehensive audit, for example, or something like that. In terms of the like the concern about getting out of that I heard from Sam Bayer about not wanting to let people off the hook of the original production goals of the law. I think that's why this best practices list needs to be good, like, and adjusted, but I don't think it's impossible. And so, like, I'll close with this to say, I think if this is not the means by which we define politically difficult actions that are good enough, what is the means of policy change going to be? Again, I'll say the purpose of the accountability program is to address the political barriers at the local level. And if we're pretending that we're solving any other problem, I think we're wasting our time. I think we should be thinking about what are the political barriers at the local level and how is this going to solve that? And if there's not an objective set of good enough lists, the equivalent of the minimum compliance standard in the fourplex bill, then I don't know how we're going to achieve policy change. Thanks.
Thanks, Michael. Samuel.
Yeah, so as Michael said, I am someone who had had some skepticism maybe in the last meeting. In follow-up conversations, I think that I am more amenable to the idea that there needs to be a menu of best practices that are responsive to different types of communities. Because it's really it is that one size fits all responses to need. Something that works in one community could actually harm communities in a different context. And so I think that whatever happens, there needs to continue to be refinement based on the contextualized housing need. I do think that whether a city has instituted best practices or not probably could really work with the type of audit. I also think that there are particular equity targets or particular production targets that are easier to set best practice to, like accessibility, for instance. You have this much accessibility need. These are the types of codes that you simply have to have in order to meet that need, right? Like that's a pretty objective thing that you could set a marker to. But there are other contexts, like there really is, even just going through the different HCAs and HPSs that have come through, there is so much variability even within one county about home ownership rates from one jurisdiction to another, or demographics, age. And so that was always my wariness around, a lot of the language around best practices. So I do think that there are ways to get there without completely passing the concept.
Great, thank you. Barbara?
Again, as a small jurisdiction, I would appreciate a matrix that says, I don't know if it's possible or not, that says that basically if you have this issue, here's a menu of choices, as Sam said. If you have this issue, here's a menu of choices. If you have this issue, here's a menu of choices. Some of those will work for your jurisdiction, some of them won't. Hopefully that you can find some that work. I am concerned about being able to develop the housing production strategy in the future without some assistance, either technical assistance from DLCD, monetary assistance, or something like this where there's a menu of choices. Where we could take it to our planning commission and say, hey, here's this issue, here are some choices. What do you think? Let's talk about it. And then make that recommendation to city council. We're a staff of 2 people to do everything having to do with planning. And it's just really helpful to have as much assistance from the state for this type of thing as possible. So I would appreciate a matrix or something, even if it's technical assistance, not codified, but actually listed in guidance documents.
Yeah. So Thea, correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's still very much on the table. It's part of what already exists. It's going to be augmented. I think that the real question is, are there a set of best practices that can be broadly applicable and define in advance what is within a jurisdiction, an individual jurisdiction's control or not? Or is that going to be a case by case determination? And I think at this point, with what DLCD knows about the process and about the best practices that they've got at their disposal, that it seemed more prudent to not create a one size fits all metric about what's within a city's control and to defer that until an actual audit.
Yeah, Cadence, you're exactly right. And Barbara, to your point, I think that, you know, we have definitely heard from cities that they want some kind of interface. And I think that this is, you know, absolutely something that we're going to be working on, where you plug in an issue and you come out with a set of solutions. That is something that we know needs to happen and needs to be developed. There's a spreadsheet right now. It's, you know, hard to read and it takes work and time to even just read that thing. So we're gonna be working on, you know, developing that out to be a lot more sort of user friendly, so that you will not have to do as much work.
Thank you.
Also, yeah, absolutely. And also when it is time for a city to do this housing work, technical assistance and funding will be available. That's part of the agreement, and so that's, you know, that's more or less built in. But I think yeah, I think you're right, Cadence. The issue is how do we come up with something that works for every city, that is sufficient, you know, a sufficient sort of set of solutions for every city, given the broad range. And Michael, you might have some great ideas here. I have some thoughts too. And I mean, part of what I'm sort of hoping to talk about eventually is if there's a set of sort of high impact strategies that you can kind of maybe there's a kind of point system or something like that. And, you know, that's not necessarily on the table right now, but it's not something that we don't want to talk about either. So Michael, curious to hear your thoughts on developing this.
Sorry, a lot of thinking about all these things you're all saying. I'm losing track of where I was going, but so I what I heard, I really like Barbara's suggestion of a if this, then that sort of menu items. And I could imagine that coming as part of the audit process and as part of like the housing acceleration agreement. Like, here's the list, and we're going to sit down with you, and that's going to be on the table when we sit down with you is this grid, and let's find the things. And if that needs to be further downstream for whatever reason, I don't think that's terrible as long as the audit rate is sufficient that enough cities are going to get to that table
Yeah. So
eventually.
I'll just say, Michael, that is actually what in the audit. In the audit rule right now is
Okay.
that DLCD will come back with sort of a menu of options. A city may also propose their own option in that
Right.
in that discussion, but DLCD comes, you know, there's this barrier, here's the set of solutions. Let's work together to find the best way forward.
Right. Okay. Well, then that leads to my next point, which is that I think if it's something that DLCD is perceived to be coming up with on the fly every single time, then it's not going to have a lot of political capital behind it. And DLCD will find itself constantly starved for political capital to get cities to do the unpopular, difficult thing, unless that's a pre-baked list that's written into the rule. It's hard to change. And I think you want to tie yourself to the mast in that way, or else cities will constantly be challenging it. And then in doing so, even if they lose, like 75% of the time, that other 25% will gradually erode the norm. And that's where we are right now, it seems to me, with LCDC compliance orders.
So then timing might be part of the question, right? What happens in January of 2025? What emerges in subsequent rulemaking in 26 and 27? Because I could envision a process where you go through a couple cycles of audits and you could just say, well, if you're not hitting X target or if you're experiencing Y barrier and you haven't done two of these four things, it is clear to us that there are actions remaining within your control and you need to do something. And that then a growing list of actions becomes sort of normalized. And so maybe those to become, as to your point, Michael, that you don't have to like sort of rehash them every single time. You add them as guidance or you put them in rule.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to the extent that we're kicking things into future years, I'm always nervous about that. I feel like this is a unusual opportunity with a ton of political capital and buy-in, and we've all spent a year talking about it. So like, as little decision making as can be pushed into the future, the better.
So maybe, Thea, I'm thinking on the fly, but we are having a barriers conversation and doing sort of a walkthrough of how would we take a specific barrier and identify, kind of walk through the whole process in anticipation of that October 8th meeting. It would be great if you all could think about what measures, actions, best practices, however you want to define it, you think are relevant to various barriers that you think should be sort of like evidence of actions that can be taken within a city's control. And what is that sort of floor of actions that we think might make sense, either for specific categories of jurisdictions, like Samuel, you're saying, like different cohorts, or just across the state of Oregon, right? And I think like the more assistance DLCD has from you all in identifying those best practices, the better, and the more likely it would be able for those to show up in V3.
Yeah, I think that's a really good call, Cadence, and I think we should absolutely do that. I guess I'm also curious to maybe talk about if the referral is the best place for this to show up in this program. If there's another point in this process where where we can kind of fall back on a set of strategies that we know works really well. And using this as a mitigating factor for not getting referred into the program was one idea that we put on the table, but it's certainly not the only place. And Michael, I think that you've thought about this a lot, and maybe some of the rest of you have thoughts about this too. No need to bring it right this moment, but would definitely love to hear about that, especially as sort of we move through the, well, I mean, I guess in order to get it into V3, we do need to, see something on the table pretty soon. But, not to say the book is closed. I hear you, Michael. This is an opportunity, and I think that we need to do the bulk of the work right now. But I think that, the program can be finessed in future rulemakings. So anyway, any thoughts about if there's a different point at which something like this, a set of best practices or safe harbor in terms of action selection, which is something that they're also talking about in the NAPTAC, I will say, comes into play. We're certainly interested to hear. Sam, go ahead.
I haven't super thought about this yet, so there's definitely room for refinement here. I definitely hear, I guess it was when we were talking in the last slide, the concern of like, no one's going to hit these targets. And at least, initially or maybe ever, but, based on the limited number of the limited capacity that DLCD has to do audits, obviously only a certain number are going to be referred for performance-based reasons. But there's probably going to be a number of cities who qualify a bunch of times. And maybe if they are on that list of cities that are qualifying, but they're not quite so bad that they get selected, then that could trigger some, we need to see these things in your next HPS. Or, I think that the HPS is probably the point where, the leverage point where it would have to get introduced. But yeah, maybe some kind of dynamic like that, where if you are on that list of qualifying cities for referral more than once, but you're not far enough down, then you are going to have to start instituting some. Again, very initial thought on this.
Is there a difference between that and the basic versus comprehensive audit distinction? Like, this seems like a sort of a spin on that.
Well, the basic versus comprehensive part was that was something that I had mentioned what feels like months ago now, which is that if a city has already instituted best practices and they're still on that low performing one, then that's indicative of some barrier that only a comprehensive audit is going to bring to the surface. That was my thought there. I'm thinking like cities that are not quite bad enough to even be audited. They're in the lower 50, but they're not quite at the bottom.
They're on the watch list. And if
They're
you're
on
on
the watch list,
list,
exactly.
yeah, if you're on the
Exactly.
watch list, that goes around to then what is the threshold for HPS approval by DLCD in the first place, right? And so it seems like that's a logical place where a matrix of here are the 25 things that you can do for the 10 different issues that you might be encountering. And at PS, those of you on the watch list, we're going to be taking essentially a stricter look at the ones that you choose, and you got to make sure you choose some of these ones. And I think that's really an interesting point, and I'm wondering, Thea, how we could consider incorporating that into rules, or is it regardless of how you're doing at every HPS adoption, there are like starred practices that really make some good sense, especially if you have specific fair housing issue areas identified.
Yeah, Sam, go ahead if you have a response to this. Yeah.
Well, kind of. I actually have a question about, I know Sean is the statute guy, but the HOPO is not involved in the acceleration by statute,
Yeah.
but could a condition be that a city has to work with HOPO to develop particular best practices for their city?
That's a good question. The HAPA wouldn't be the place to develop best practices, but if, for instance, one of the barriers is that one of the barriers sort of revealed in an audit is that, you know, there's you know, a really an extremely cumbersome permitting process or something, or, you know, entitlement process, then that is something that I think the HAPO is positioned to help work through that specific kind of code issue. But it is pretty narrowly focused on like code and code compliance.
Okay. I guess thinking all the way back to the beginning of this process, when we talked about mitigating factors, I had said if a city has worked with HAPO in the last however long, then that's maybe a potential mitigating factor. But I guess this could be another way to operationalize that.
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting idea. And again, you know, I think it highlights the interconnectedness of these programs, which is really, you know, the HPS is where a lot of these decisions are getting made, and where along the line do we institute this set of best practices, these starred or high impact actions that could, you know, could be incorporated. I think that I'm not sure. I think that's certainly a conversation. If you tune in to the RAC meeting tomorrow, I think you will see that this is a conversation very much on the table in the NAPTAC portion, and whether it's sufficient there, you know, if that's what comes of that conversation, if that is sufficient to sort of answer this, you know, this concern, I'm not sure, and would definitely be curious to hear your all thoughts on that.
Okay. I have one other thought. I'm sorry, I'm taking up too much time, but this just came to me.
We love it.
Okay, so I feel like I've been thinking about this one size fits all thing backwards. Maybe the contextualized housing need is a contraindication for why a particular best practice wouldn't work. So like the best practice list stays the same and could be applied broadly, but then the cities have the opportunity to challenge those on the basis of what their contextualized housing need finds. They could justify that this is that our situation is a contraindication for this being having positive outcomes.
So then, Sam, would you say that the best practices list would be the ceiling, not the floor? So you would say you would have to do all of these things unless your contextualized housing needs said no?
Right now, there's not a ceiling or a floor, it seems to me. So.
Well, right. I mean,
Possibly.
I think the idea was, right, with the best practices list is you would have to have a set of actions that would be broadly applicable across the state. And if it was going to be workable, it would have to, more than one or two jurisdictions would have to be able to make use of it. And so essentially that would be a floor. And so some would have to stretch, some wouldn't be able to make it, and some would just be able to coast right over it. And I think what I'm hearing from Samuel is that we want that to be a higher measure, and then the contextualized housing need would say, well, obviously they can't or should not be doing these 3 of the 20 or whatever.
That sounds right. I still think that there's probably going to need to be a little menuification based on sizes or on the ground realities of different types of cities. But yeah, I think that maybe that's the direction to get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, I like that too.
All right, in the interest of time, why don't we move to the next one and see how this next topic goes?
All right. I think this one is simpler. This is more of a language connection that really just codifies that DLCD needs to really consider specifically the barriers that relate to identified fair housing issue areas. And this is, this was really just that, it was, I think I will say the intention was already there in the rules, but it wasn't very clearly spelled out. And so hopefully this helps clarify that the acceleration program, the audit will respond directly to the barriers that are addressing a need that has a connection to fair housing issues, and sort of elevating those as a target in the review. Let me just make sure I'm not missing anything in my notes here. I think that it really was kind of just this one clause that we added. And I think that's about it. Happy to open it up. And again, one thing that I would love to hear about is if there's other opportunities to sort of integrate these 2 sets of provisions a little bit more closely. The work that's being set up in the NAPTAC to strengthen this contextualized housing need, and then to come back and make sure that that's really deeply like integrated and focused on in the acceleration program as well.
Thoughts on this, or any other spots in the acceleration process that you think need to be more direct ties back to fair housing issue areas, ensuring equitable outcomes, affirmatively furthering fair housing, similar ideas, but not exactly the same in the acceleration program itself? Okay. Next one.
Okay, super. So this was sort of a set of revisions that we put in place because we, as I mentioned before, sort of heard several concerns about the tie-in of capacity. And I will say that, I think that there was a fair amount of tie-ins with city capacity in the version 1, but really these refinements are intended to sort of clarify like precisely how DLCD will factor these capacity issues into both the audit and the agreement. So this first provision really just enables that DLCD. This one is kind of specifically about DLCD capacity. It names several elements of the Goal 10 work products that DLCD considers in terms of like what is coming in the door on a given year, so that DLCD can determine our own staff capacity to take on a set of audits. The second provision here digs in a little bit more to evaluate and audit what the city's capacity and resources are to carry out a specific audit. The second, like this sub 6 provision here just actually pulls out the determination of city control into its own subsection and clarifies city capacity and available funding are central to the DLCD's determination of what is within the city's control. And finally, sub 7 there really clarifies that DLCD needs to prioritize actions that help to build a city's capacity. So if capacity concerns are identified as an issue in the audit, then DLCD has this sort of extra directive that actions need to be centered around developing capacity for the city. And again, this is sort of a bunch of relatively small revisions and additions, but hopefully taken together, they allay some of the concerns that we heard about considering capacity. Yeah, open it up to conversation if there's more detail, and we can also go back to I couldn't quote the full provisions here because there were a lot of them, so we can go back to the matrix if that's helpful also.
All right, folks. Michael.
Just to make the obvious point, I don't currently have the capacity to replace my roof, but if my roof blows off, I'm sure going to take out credit card debt to replace my roof. So it's all very, very subjective, and to name names that building on Tom's example that he did not use, like West Lynn did not always ban apartment buildings, and now since then they've found the capacity to do so, and it may be a small city, but they can find the capacity eventually to re-legalize them.
Yeah. Tom.
Yeah, I'm not sure what is meant by an action that builds a city's capacity. And other than, sort of what's implied here is DLCD will give resources. Those are grants. Those are not, they may do one action, or technical assistance to do something, build into the zoning code, as Michael's saying, but those seem to be very temporary. And whereas this implies, and this the whole thing implies more structural changes to actually prioritize resources towards housing, right? And maybe it means shifting resources from economic development to housing because the state as a whole has prioritized housing production, kind of thing, and other budget choice, parks funding or whatever, that no, we need to be about housing. I'm not sure that this language actually gets to that level of detail, or just it seems like build a city's capacity is a little too coded, and not explicit enough about what is meant by that.
So Thea, this might be a good opportunity to bring up the matrix. Let's see. See if that was sub 7. I think I can put it in the chat. And maybe I'll do that because there is a little bit more detail in the rule itself. It's on page 68 of the draft rule. This is not going to read great, but Barb, well, please.
So, I see this as a different way, and I appreciate this being in here. So I understand where you're coming from, Tom, that you could reprioritize funding, if you have that funding. We have a number of parks. We have 3 public works employees to make improvements to the parks. We don't have any recreation. We don't have any capacity for recreation programs. So we're already as thin as we can be. We have a total of 50 employees for a city of 14,000 people, almost 15. So to say that you can reprioritize funding, we don't have funding for economic development. We have an urban renewal plan that has yet to bring in $1 million. We're less than, I think we're about 600,000 to date. And we're using that to try to acquire a derelict gas station to help prioritize redevelopment so that we can get more money in our urban renewal district. So to throw out there and say, oh, you could just reprioritize funding works for some jurisdictions, but certainly doesn't work for all of them. I think that's all I want to say on that. So
Thank you, Barbara.
And thanks, Cadence, for pulling in that that actual language. Tom, I think this might address your questions a little bit, and if you, I'm not sure if that, I think it is to some extent what you're saying, also identifying what other, what other program, what other funding is available. DLCD can kind of serve as a, as a liaison or a conduit to bring in potential streams of funding, if such exist, but also to, help, yeah, I mean, and understanding that different cities have different financial circumstances, help cities sort of really audit their financial circumstance and provide a little bit of that political backing to push where there is funding allocated in certain ways, to push that towards housing. And this is a controversial part of the statute, but it's very much in the statute, so something that we needed to respond to in the rule.
Is there any way to differentiate between actions that are of a substantial cost and actions that are not of a substantial cost? Like, every action has a cost. I remember hearing about the CFAC. Some city was saying that they couldn't possibly remove, they couldn't start charging for parking on the street unless DLCD paid for their no parking signs. And that may be true, but like at some point there needs to be some cutoff for like what is and isn't a reasonable request. Is that in the statute already, or is that in any of these rules? How do you make that decision?
That's a good question, Michael. I don't think that's reflected in the rules. And I'm trying to think through what that would mean if we did. I mean, there's some sorting that would need to happen at some level, and I'm not sure who does that and where. And if that should be in rule, if maybe it should be in guidance somewhere. And if that would still have the effect.
I guess I would argue that if you're going to leave yourself this out for that sort of a reasonable negotiation, you also need to give yourself some sort of sideboards, because otherwise everybody's going to make that reasonable. It's like, I can't afford to do this thing unless you fund every single penny of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fair point.
Barbara.
So I think that there are financial accounting ways of determining whether a city has extra money to do different things that are fairly straightforward. You don't necessarily have to codify them. You could have them in guidance. I think that there are a number of jurisdictions, especially I'll say some of the smaller ones that really don't have a lot of economic funding, that they're already maxed out in their mill rate, and we're not seeing a lot of increase in taxable value. And I think both of those could be factors that you look at. And then look at the number of employees to land area, employees to income level, or taxable value. Any of those factors could be reasonable to look at, or all of them together, to give you that picture.
I think it is clear in statute that DLCD is provided with the both the right and responsibility of making a determination of what is within a city's control and what is sort of a reasonable action for them to take. And so whether they use that or not, and how the degree to which they use that, I think is an open question.
Sean, just in time, we need your statutory knowledge here. I think working through this is, it's complicated. Sean, have you landed here? Hi.
Oh yeah. Yeah, sorry. Thanks. My other meeting ended a little bit early, so I'm back here.
We're just sort of digging into this this new sub 7 with regards to the determination that a city lacks reasonable existing resources, and where sort of where to draw the sideboards for what DLCD can and can't do in terms of directing city resources. And I don't know if anybody wants to sort of recap where we're at in this conversation. Cadence, maybe you can give Sean a little bit of a update.
Well, I think it's the double-edged sword, Sean, right? On the one hand, it is helpful for cities like Cornelius that are cash strapped to have an acknowledgement that they might not be able to reprioritize general fund or other monies for use in housing. And we also know that there are other jurisdictions that are in a better financial situation and have elected not to prioritize housing. And so how do we create a set of rules that sort of acknowledge both kinds of jurisdictions, and how does DLCD essentially suss out who is who and take action accordingly? And we're going round and around about that one.
Does anybody have any brilliant ideas? I guess the only thing, so the way it's written currently, and maybe there's a way we can change it, is essentially just saying, all right, when DLCD is doing this review, we identify barriers. If there is, if any of the barriers involve things that could be addressed via city action, we provide options. as part of providing those options, we evaluate, all right, how many resources would an action like this typically take, right? Code amendments might take a certain amount of staff capacity, whereas maybe something that's programmatic takes more staff capacity, right? So you want to acknowledge those differences. And then also we added in findings saying, we're also going to think about how does this compare to the city's existing capacity based on what we learned through the audit process. And if we find like, hey, there really isn't a whole lot of capacity to do really much of anything here, then that's the barrier, right? And what we should focus on are any types of actions that say, for example, build revenue or provide staff capacity. Maybe there's federal programs that could be leveraged or state programs, right? And just identify, like that becomes the focus of the barrier. If there's a better way of approaching it, I'm pretty open to it. I just don't know how to do that other than through the lens of kind of discretion and nuance, right, through the audit process.
And I really appreciate that, Sean. I think that that is a helpful approach to making sure that the jurisdictions that really need additional capacity can somehow find a way through to get more capacity. It's not that a jurisdiction like mine doesn't want to provide the housing that's needed. It's as opposed to maybe another jurisdiction that is just recalcitrant and is a bad actor, as Tom noted earlier. We just don't have it right now, the ability. And so I appreciate that this is in there for jurisdictions like ours.
Yeah, and I appreciate what Barbara's saying, and I think also making a difference, this building city's capacity, and maybe I'm a little, there's two types of capacity, right? And I think it needs to be calibrated to the specific action. And right, does it take one-time funding to do a project or does it take sustainable programmatic funding over the longer term and not just a 1 or 2 year grant kind of thing? And being able to make the distinction between that. I don't know that needs to actually be in the statute as opposed to some sort of guidance document that talks about these different things. And we struggle with the same issue, like permitting timelines, right? We don't, I think most cities fund their development review through permitting fees, which is a barrier to housing development, right? And so there you're caught in this vicious circle of, that's where something that we need to add more capacity, and we need to have a different sustainable funding stream that would staff up the development review, that would speed up permitting timelines. It's one of the issues, right? The other is too many regulations or whatever. But I think that's making those distinctions about certain actions take, one-time funding, state, federal money, whatever, great. But some sustainable, the other is around capacity over the long term.
Okay, we've got 25 minutes, folks. Shall we move on to what I think is the last one before we just open it up for general comments and questions and concerns? Okay.
All right, sounds good. So let's see, this final edit, hold on just a minute. Let me clear out my screen. Working on this tiny laptop screen and everything is all jammed up. This set of revisions is sort of intended to, well, I have it written reduce engagement burden, but I also want to elevate that it's both about reducing engagement burden and tying back to the actions that are in the HPS. So the first one is that the first provision here is that an identification of relevant actions proposed in the existing housing production strategy and evaluation of efficacy of action to address an identified barrier really has to look at what what actions were already proposed in the adopted HPS, and that the first round in an acceleration agreement will pull up those actions that were already identified by a city and adopted in their HPS to be sure that those are integrated in how a city is addressing an identified barrier, a barrier that was identified in the audit. The second one is, again, sort of about tying back to the HPS, but specifically with regards to engagement. And this was intended to reduce the asks on a community, specifically on community members and CBOs who are often asked to engage in these processes, and be sure that we're not sort of, burdening them with duplicating effort where the engagement has already occurred, to sort of go back to that engagement and make sure that we're drawing the information that those members of the community already provided about what barriers they're facing to housing production, affordability, and choice. And just so this language really just builds that into the process, to make sure that connection is particularly strong. And again, this is just another effort to make sure that the HPS portion of the rules and the acceleration portion of the rules are really talking to each other and really integrated. And happy to dig in if there are more places that we could make that connection, if we can make that connection stronger, or if anybody has thoughts about this particular language, and the way we've decided to do that here.
All right, folks. Sam.
I guess my question would be, are there opportunities for community groups to voluntarily participate in the audit process? People who were not included in the original community engagement is immediately what I'm thinking, but also, people who did, and maybe even their strategies were selected, but they're not happy with how it's been implemented. I want to make sure that there's ample opportunity for those voices to be heard.
Yeah, certainly the intention is not to limit
Yeah.
more engagement.
Okay.
It's just to ensure that we're not going back and retapping people who are already tapped out. But I think that another part of the rule that I didn't include here, that was an addition, you may have seen it as you combed through the changes, was that we specifically identify groups that need to be invited to engage, and that's to make sure that folks are not slipping through the cracks, and that there's sort of a very proactive effort to ensure that folks are invited to the table. But I appreciate that that needs to be something that's really strengthened and elevated.
Please, Michael.
To loop back to the first conversation of these decisions, it has seemed to me since the beginning of this process that that's part of the case for making a high stakes HPS that doesn't give a lot of amendments, with some potential exceptions for like if there's a way to do that. But the more you hold people to their commitments in the HPS, the more high stakes the HPS process will become, the more time efficient it will be for community groups to engage with the HPS process, because they know there is not going to be another backdoor negotiation to get out of the stuff that they were getting the city to commit to in the light of the HPS process.
Yeah. Agreed.
I presume we already talked about the replacing actions with the plan. Okay, great. Yeah. And
So
really
we can get back into it, Sean, if you want.
No.
It's not like we finished that conversation.
No, I'll loop back later. But yeah, and really, actually, both of these items were kind of implicit, but I think we heard that we should try to rely more on what's already in the HPS, or at least make sure that it's explicit that we're incorporating these things. And obviously one of them is like, hey, sometimes the city already proposed the solution to the barrier, right? And so that's one thing that we want to make sure is reflected. And that can be part of the audit. And then the other part is really just around, if we're going to do engagement, which we absolutely should, and we should invite CBOs, to participate, and other community members, but also let's make sure that we're bringing in, any engagement that the city's done, so we can check in on it, right? And say, hey, these are the themes that we've heard or have seen reflected in either your HPS or in other things that you've done. So just to, better strengthen that tie.
So I want to offer you all a few minutes before we wrap up to offer any thoughts that you have or reflections on the V2 rules that we haven't covered, or if you want to put a finer point on stuff we have already covered, please, now is an opportunity. And if you have questions, also an opportunity to get those answered by the team.
And we know some of y'all have submitted proposals too after we had kind of wrapped up version 2, so we definitely want to hear that.
Yeah. Barbara.
Hi, so I was rereading the new contextualized housing need, and it occurs to me that there's still a significant data issue. And for instance, I don't know how I would do this contextualized housing need analysis. Our block groups our census tracts include so much land outside our city limits. We don't have any that are just in our city limits. All of them contain significant area outside our city limits. I don't know how to get this data. So I'm really concerned about being held to a certain standard and not being able to meet it with the existing data that's out there. And I'm sure there are other small jurisdictions that are in the same boat, because it's a function of the way tracts are determined with the population size. They're between 4,000 and 8,000 people. When you're a jurisdiction of 14,000 or less, it's very difficult to get enough data that's within your city limits to really account for this type of information.
Yeah, Barbara. So we'll relay that to our colleagues. That is a NAPTAC issue on the contextualized housing needs side. It's something that they've also been hearing and have been thinking about a lot. I think the way that it's designed is to say, hey, when cities do kind of this fair housing issue area analysis, we start with data that's publicly available through the equity indicators that OHCS is producing, and then where we kind of reach the limits of that. If cities have additional information they can add into that, that's great. If they don't, right, we kind of fill in the gaps with people's lived experiences with things like engagement, right, that type of thing, understanding that the data is never going to be perfect and never going to give you a full picture of what's going on. And so it's, at least my understanding of the intent, and NAPTAC folks can speak better to this, they are thinking a lot about that data adequacy piece and how we fill in those gaps where the data is insufficient, especially in small cities. But that's just something to be aware of. It is something that they have been thinking about a lot.
And yet we'll be held accountable for trying to come up with ways to overcome our fair housing issues. And so I just point that out. Okay.
Right.
Thanks.
Right. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Barbara. Michael. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Thanks a lot. I was struck in the conversation about the suburban jurisdictions. Tom mentioned that Metro is one venue for talking about shared interests across city lines, and Metro's housing coordination strategy is currently a hyphen on page 49. I wonder if there's any room for guidance to help with that, or if that's part of the conversation at all. Like, is there some way to advise Metro on what its coordination strategy might be?
Yeah, and this is one of those areas too where we're again, also a little bit on the NAPTAC side, because the housing coordination strategy is a regional corollary to the housing production strategy. But I think one of the questions that we have is there's kind of a mixture of a logistical and timing issue here. On the one end, it's like, yes, you have this housing coordination strategy, and it's supposed to kind of mirror the HPS in a lot of ways, but it's different in the sense that it's regional. So there's differences, but it's also the same. So how do you, is there any need for clarifying rules? But then the second one is the fact that Metro's HCS is due in 2025. So it's a conversation that we've like been thinking about. We don't really have a good solution to yet, and that's why it's kind of a dash or an asterisk there. We don't really know.
2025 being like far enough that you're triaging it off of your plates
Right.
at this very moment.
Yeah.
I guess I would say it seems like it may be worth getting to once you can. That's all.
Mhm.
I don't know if Daisy has anything to add to that.
No, thank you so much for the question, Michael. We are trying to figure that out and we're working with DLCD. So we're in close communication. I don't know that we are aligned internally at Metro in terms of, what this housing coordination strategy could be. But I do look forward to engaging a lot of the folks here once we get a little further in our planning phase. So thank you for asking.
Other thoughts, questions, concerns?
John mentioned that we have gotten some proposals, and thank you so much for those. And I just want to encourage people to keep throwing them at us, even if they're not super developed. Just really curious to hear your thoughts about sort of how to get this to the point where it's totally finessed for version 3. Yeah, Michael, go ahead.
One of the big things in the proposal that Julia put together for our coalition was like the need for some attention to spatial justice within each jurisdiction. And that's obviously not in this to the extent that I can see, though a lot seems to be resting on the words "plan for" in that what is the contextualized need analysis. I would just say, as we have before, that it seems like we can't truly have an equity assessment of many jurisdictions without thinking about what's going on in different parts of different cities, at least in the larger jurisdictions. So that'll be, I'm sure that will continue to be something we'll be asking for, and we're going to get you as like a proposal enlightened by this conversation as soon as possible.
Okay.
I will say I'm looking forward to these next couple of meetings where we do have the test cases. I think the more examples, like here's how the process will work, and here are the issues we're going to look at, and here's just whether it's the test case studies or guidance or whatever, anything that helps sort of take this out of the rules realm and into the creating expectations. Here's how it works in the real world. And you take into all the factors that Barbara's raising or other things. Like, here's how we expect this to play out, at least in this first round, the next 6 years as we get experience with all of this stuff, where we can look across the landscape at different HPSs and see how detailed or not detailed different jurisdictions come up with their strategies. I mean, we need to calibrate how much information you're providing versus, what it looks like to implement these actions. We've gone round and round the value of a study or an explore action versus, and the 6-year time frame and that sort of thing. But I think the more examples that can be given on how we expect this to work, it'll help clarify what the rule language means.
I'm excited about it too, Tom. Sean and Thea know that this is this is the good stuff as far as I'm concerned, because sometimes it's hard, like it's hard to see how a certain sentence structure or set of words will work for different case studies or real jurisdictions. And this is going to be our opportunity, even though, of course, there will be 30 other, fact patterns that may not fit the same case study that we do. At least we'll have kind of walked through it together and seen how it can operate. And I think that will be very helpful for all of us.
And maybe as a plug too, one of the things that we'll have to be thinking about and developing is kind of like that Goldilocks barrier that showcases as much of the rule as possible. So if you have any ideas or suggestions, we're all ears.
Yes, please bring us some ideas. That would be super helpful.
My suggestion would be to use an example of something that is likely to be politically unpopular.
Yeah. And, we haven't figured out the run of show for how those two meetings will go yet. But if we have an opportunity to do a couple different examples of barriers one time or referral the next, so that we can see nuance, especially if we can get, we've talked a lot today about sort of the reluctant actor versus the broke actor, right? And just to put it bluntly, right? And so maybe it would be good to have some case studies where you can compare and see if we're actually able to tease out different responses, or how that shows up in barriers and the actions that come forward.
Yeah, we'll be thinking about it. It's tough because on the one end, you want to be as detailed as you can to showcase as much of the rule, but if you also want to provide a diversity, right? So like that kind of, which one do you do, shallow and a lot of examples or one deep example? I don't know the answer to that yet, but we'll figure that out. But
So that is what is on deck for us, right? So our next meeting is on October 8th, and that's where we'll be going through some of the barriers discussion. And then the following is on October 22nd, where we'll have some anonymized data so that we can walk through referral in a hypothetical year and see how that shakes out and some of the nuances that emerge from that analysis. Yeah, Michael.
How much editing is it reasonable for us to think might happen in the October 1st draft?
That's a great question.
I think I'll defer to Sean here, but I think that since the areas that are sort of still being worked on are there's only a few of them really. I think, we can, if there are significant changes that need to happen, significant changes can happen. I think that, definitely, there's room for things to change. I guess I'll leave it there. This is nothing is set in stone, and nothing is, nothing is done right now.
also,
We should keep asking for the moon. I mean, give us some help here.
All right, Michael.
Wait. Well, how upset were you guys with version 2?
I was upset.
Michael
I wasn't
upset.
here for most of this conversation.
No, I mean, Michael, I heard you have some very specific, concerns, and so I'll say that, we're definitely hearing those, and but I think that they're pretty targeted, right? Like, as far as I understand.
Yeah, I mean, the solution might be some sort of structural change. I guess that's what I'm imagining. It's like we were talking about, well, maybe you move some of the standards into the audit process somehow. Maybe you rearrange Sam's idea about the different triggers for the audit, or the fallback. It's not an audit, it's a different thing. The watch list. Those, I don't know if those are too structural to function after October 1st.
I don't know what they are, but I'll loop back and we'll see. But I'd say the only thing that is, the difference between version 1 and version 2, we're mostly relatively kind of narrow, right? Like, we didn't overhaul the rule entirely, mostly because the things that we heard were like, yeah, these things need fixing and tweaking, but fix and tweak them, right? I can already think that, you know, we likely will have some of those additional fixing and tweakings from version 2 to version 3. But I think we're certainly not closed off to the idea of like making additional changes where it makes sense. I just don't know what those are. So I'll loop back with Thea and Cadence and we'll see what needs to change.
All right, folks. Any last questions or thoughts before we close for the day? I hope you all tune into the RAC meeting later this week, right, Thea? Or is
It's
it
tomorrow.
Yeah, tomorrow.
okay, tomorrow, from 9 to noon, yeah?
That's right. Yep, yeah, please do. And curious to hear. I think some of the conversation that we had today will be reflected in that in that meeting. Tom.
Is it tomorrow or Thursday?
Oh, is it Thursday?
What is it? What is
The
even
invite
the day?
shows up on
What's
Thursday
time?
on my calendar.
Oh, it is Thursday. Yes, Thursday
Okay,
morning.
you're right. Wow, we're ahead of the game, Sean. That's
Oh
not
yeah,
happened.
we're full of misinformation today.
All right. Yes. So
Okay,
join us
tuning on
Thursday.
Thursday, and we'll see you again for this team meeting on October 8th. And in the meantime, if you have specific comments, please feel free to send them to the DLCD team. We're definitely interested in hearing from y'all still. So
Yeah.
thank you so much.
And Michael, if you want to rewrite that section, just send it over and we'll see.
Sounds exciting.
All right.
All right, bye,
Thanks so much,
folks.
everybody.